Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of You're Just Stupid, the podcast that makes you smarter and stupider at the same time. My name's Ray, aka Easy in Every Way, and here with me I have my co host Rene, aka Just Throw Me in the Trash. And we have a topic today that I'm a little bit in the dark about, so please enlighten me,
So
Rene.
real quick, listeners, I just want to say, if any of you ever find me dead, just put me in the trash. It's simple as that. That
Easy
that would
enough.
honor my last wishes. So Ray, I would say in general, you're a very well traveled person. Would you say so?
I would like
Yeah,
to think
I, I,
that,
th- I think
yes.
you are. I think you've well traveled. What would you say is one of the most annoying and frustrating parts about traveling?
There are a lot, but I would say actual air travel and getting through customs has to be one of the most
So
annoying
basically, dealing with the
situations.
airport, right?
Yeah, I would say that. And then transportation as well too can be really annoying within the country, depending on the country. It can be very frustrating.
Agreed. We're not going to be talking about transportation much today, but we're going to be talking about airports and in
Oh,
general.
okay.
What would you say has been your longest layover ever? Just thinking off the top of your head, of course.
When I was in Turkey with my mom, I had a 12-hour
12,
layover,
12
and I
hours.
really 12 hours, yeah, and I really wanted to get out and like check out Turkey, but my mom was a little anxious about getting out and then getting back in, so we kind of just chilled at the airport.
Yeah, how did it feel staying 12 hours in the airport?
It wasn't too bad because Turkey's kind of cheap, so we definitely got some like manicures and pedicures, and we
Oh,
got some nice food, so it wasn't horrible,
so
but it was very annoying.
so
I
it was
would not have
annoying.
wanted
Okay,
to
all right,
go.
all right,
Yeah.
cool. I was hoping you were going to say awful, but at least you said annoying. Cool. Now imagine if your layover was actually something more like 17 years.
Oh, I think I know who we're gonna talk about.
So we're going to talk about multiple people today, but yeah, we're going to talk about people who live in the airport.
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
I think that's so funny you said that because I recently just watched that Tom
the
Hanks
terminal. Yeah,
movie.
yeah. So the
Yes.
terminal is very quasi based on the last guy we're going to talk about. We're actually going to save the most interesting story for last. And the guy who actually inspired this, it wasn't the movie The Terminal. I actually have never even seen The Terminal. So the inspiration from this episode is twofold. I traveled to California recently, and as I was just sitting in the airport because I wanted to save some battery on my phone and iPad. I'm sorry, my Kindle. So I was just looking around the airport. I'm like, it's gotta be a shit place to live. And I'm like, I wonder if people have lived in the airport. And I looked up again. The last guy we're going to talk about is the guy who I started this. I'm like, damn, this is a really interesting story. And I went into it more, and then I was talking to a coworker. Shout out to John, by the way, if you're listening. He's part of the inspiration for this podcast. So we're going to talk about basically why three reasons why people live at the airport, and they're going to go from maybe the least interesting or funny to the most funny, most interesting. Does that sound
Okay.
good? So
Sounds fantastic.
and so basically, the first way people live in the airport is unintended extra layover. Basically, they have some paperwork that's not done, or maybe they run out of money for the next flight to the next country they're going to, or they have like their passport or visa expire on the way. So there was a couple of them that I just want to just real briefly, or like it's just like a transition period. Like one of the more famous ones, who was one of these real brief ones, was Edward Snowden. You know him, right?
Oh yeah, okay.
Very, very briefly, for the people who fucking don't know Edward Snowden. Basically, he was an American intelligence consultant who leaked extremely classified information from the NSA basically out to the world, and then fled the country, briefly stayed in the Russian airport while he was trying to establish that he could stay in the Russian embassy, and has pretty much lived there in the Russian embassy ever since. Obviously not that funny. No, I mean interesting, yes, but not that funny. But some of the more interesting ones were like, there's one gentleman, a British gentleman, who basically literally ran out of money. He missed his flight, ran out of money, and had to basically beg people for money so he could fly back home to Britain.
That's so
That
sad.
one's a little sad.
Oh,
There's a funnier one, a gentleman named Hans Mueller, a German gentleman, who flew to Rio de Janeiro to meet a woman that basically ghosted him. And he ran out of money, and eventually the British authorities, I'm sorry, the Brazilian authorities ended up taking him to a mental hospital for evaluation because there was questions on whether the woman may have ever even been real.
Do you know what ended up
I
happening
that
with that situation?
unfortunately with most of these, because with the exception of Edward Snowden, most of these people are not famous people. They're like, I mean, a lot of them got famous for living in the airport, not so like pretty much once they leave the airport, I've had a real hard time finding
Following up.
out.
He's
Yeah,
still probably puttering around in Rio de Janeiro somewhere
I don't
in his
know.
white
Like
mental hospital garb.
they just let him out just when in the hospital gown, ass floating in the breeze, still trying to find that woman in Rio to this day. And there's other even weird cryptic ones. Like there's this man named Hiroshi Nohara, Japanese man, who
Ooh, nice
was. Thank
pronunciation.
you. I like to believe that I am not able to do pronounce anything well. Anyways, so when this gentleman was actually in Mexico City, he was stuck at the airport. Obviously, being a Japanese man in Mexico, he stuck out a little bit. When people asked him, "What are you doing at the airport?" He always declined his reasons. He never got in any legal trouble. Then one day he got in a taxi, went to a random Mexican woman's house, went back to the airport, and left with a woman named Oyuki, and that's it. That's all we know.
That sounds like a Japanese name, though. So he left with a Japanese
Well,
female?
it's they don't know if that's a name or a nickname. And so when I was looking him up, it's just like every time like someone like would interview him, like a journalist would be like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" "I'm not going to tell you." Are you stuck here?" "I can't tell you." And it was just very, very weird and mysterious.
Wow,
Yeah, kind of
interesting.
weird. So that's where, and a lot of these people are people who stay in the airport 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a couple months. So those are the shortest stays. Also, like I said, that's not
That's such a long time, though. Oh my
no.
God, I hate staying there for hours.
These are the short stays of people who live in the airport. Because remember, I'm not talking about people like who you and your mom gave mani pedis done at the Turkish airport. By the way, the Turkish airport's coming up in a little bit, so I'm glad that y'all got stuck in Turkey because I want you to tell me about the Turkish airport when we reach one gentleman who has a pretty interesting story. Then the next one is more of people like in the Edward Snowden, where like they are like political refugees, and something happens. So one of the more famous examples, and also one of the longest of these stays, was a man named Sanjay Shah. He was a born in Kenya, and basically got stuck in the Nairobi airport. So his story is kind of interesting. So Mr. Shaw was born in 1962. In 1963, Kenya was granted its full independence by Britain. So in 1962, Kenya is a British colony, right? One day, Mr. Shaw gets in his head that, hey, I'm a Brit. I'm not a Kenyan. So he throws away his Kenyan, he renounces his Kenyan citizenship, throws it away, and applies for and gets a British overseas citizen passport, right? So he's like, hey, cool, I can fly to England. As soon as he gets in, he overstays his visa. They're like, hey, you got to go back to Kenya. He's like, no, 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 I'm a Brit. Never did them. I'm a Brit. I was born in British Kenya. And they're like, well, you aren't a British citizen, so they sent him back to Nairobi. And I'm using this story as a good example because a lot of the other stories that I'm going to tell today are kind of based off similar to Mr. Shaw's. So he gets back to Nairobi. Well, he can't go back to outside the airport because again he threw away his
He
Kenyan
has no
citizenship.
passport.
He has no Kenyan passport, no Kenyan citizenship. He can't go back on the Kenyan soil because he's no longer Kenyan either. So he lived in the Nairobi airport for over a year. Over
Wow.
400 days until eventually, I don't know how. Maybe he was being annoying or what, but eventually the Brits said, you know what, cool, we'll let you loophole. You're now a full British citizen, and he flew back to England and has now lived in England ever since.
Wow, good on
Yeah,
him though, I guess,
yeah,
because I bet it would have been more difficult for him to get the passport if he wasn't in the
Yeah,
airport.
exactly. Yeah, I guess basically he kind of forced it. Like, and that was probably the best of these kind of second category stories of people who just live in the airport. The because a lot of these there's a few other ones. Like for example, there was a woman named Jawra Kamalfar that basically was fleeing persecution in Iran, got stuck in
Hmm.
the in an airport in Russia, the Sheremetyevo airport in Russia, and then basically was applying to for Canadian citizenship either via Germany and Canada. And she eventually got Canadian citizenship. Her and her family had to live there 300 days. And again, another thing that helped, she had her family with her. So
So she had to take care of her family in the
yeah,
airport.
she had to take care of her family in the
Oh,
airport for 300 over 300 days.
but the thing is, it's like there's no good place to sleep in the airport. I've never been to an airport in Russia, but I'm assuming it's kind of similar. Like there's just regular chairs and a hustle and bustle constantly. Like there's no place to
And that's where
relax.
these people sleep. Every single photo I have found of someone like at the airport and they're lounging is they're just laying across several chairs. If they have the chairs that they find chairs where some of the arms can go up, they raise them up and they just lay there and that's where they sleep.
Oh my gosh, that's gotta be just miserable. And then having your family with you too
Yeah.
is just a whole other level because airports are huge. So I'd be nervous. Do you know how old her kids were?
That I don't know, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, if they were walking age, I mean, either way it would have sucked, but like I would be constantly nervous that someone would try to take them or
Oh,
like they
actually,
would
here we
run
go.
away. And
Her son was 12. Another one, and that was the oldest. Basically, she
okay.
got out on humanitarian pleas because she said her children were getting sick. Like,
Yeah, I'm sure.
yeah, and
There's
so,
no doctors there.
and exactly, and that was after 300 days. Remember, after 300 days, her children were getting sick. So I want you to remember 300 days, and you can start getting sick at the airport. So we're gonna really hear some of these more interesting,
Not a lot of good
longer.
food choices either.
No,
Like
and
McDonald's and Cinnabon.
holy shit, Ray, get out of my brain.
Sorry.
No, the reason why is because McDonald's is gonna come up here in a little bit too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, also you're a woman, and every woman can read men's minds and stuff like that.
I can, even though we're 3,000 miles apart.
Is that how far away we are right now?
Yeah, well, when I drove to Texas, it was like 3,000 miles, so I'm assuming.
Holy
Yeah,
shit! I didn't realize it was that far. America's
I
big.
think so. Merca.
America. We like our things bigger in America, like
We like everything
like our
bigger in
road
America.
trips and our asses. Anyways,
Our asses are definitely
they're
bigger.
getting bigger by the minute. There's a few other ones. I won't get into every single one of these because there's like this list that I found, and some of them, like a lot of them. There's some people who basically, their story ends up with them being arrested, or they apply for asylum and have to get forced back to their home country, and asylum doesn't work because they either lost some documents or they didn't do any paperwork, and they essentially traveled illegally. I want to get to the last category because really, this is the fun category. These are the people who voluntarily lived in the airport.
So this is like they're not stuck there, they had like a choice.
I mean, for the most part, these four guys I'm going to talk about voluntarily live in the airport, and I think they all have pretty funny stories. So
Okay.
it's funny that you mentioned, God, it must have been a nightmare to live in the airport when your family's there, right? What if you go to the airport to get away from your family?
That I can identify with a lot more.
I think I found your fellow soulmate, your spirit animal, if you want to. His name is Wei Zhongwo, and he currently lives in the Beijing Capital International Airport.
You said currently?
He is currently, if you go, I believe it's Terminal 2 in the Beijing Capital International Airport, you can meet right now Mr. Wei Zhongwo.
Oh, I've always wanted to go to Beijing. I'm gonna go to there at Terminal 2 and I'm gonna buy him a nice ass dinner.
He would appreciate that, but you know what would be an even nicer present for Mr. Zhongwo?
Tell
A
me.
bottle
A
of
flight out
booze,
of
a
there?
bottle of booze and
Oh.
cigarettes, because that is why he lives in the airport. So in his 40s, his family told him, "Hey, you need to stop drinking, you need to stop smoking, and if you don't, you're going to give us your monthly pension."
Stop it. He's 40 years
He
old.
no, he's 60 now. But
But during this
at
conversation, he was 40.
he was 46. They said, look, we're tired of your drinking. We're tired of your smoking. You need to give both of these up, or if not, we're going to take your pension so you can't pay for these things. So he said, screw you guys. I'm out of here. And he went about 40, 50 kilometers to the Beijing airport and has lived there ever since and uses his pension now to buy food, cigarettes, and booze.
So he has money then. It's not
Yeah,
like
so
a
I get
lack of money situation. It's just
yeah,
convenience.
I guess in yeah no yeah so I think I forget how much it was, but basically he gets a monthly pension from the government, and he uses his pension to buy booze, buy cigarettes, and buy food, and you look him up, Wei Zhongguo, and you'll see pictures of him like eating noodles in the Beijing airport. And
But it's going to be uncomfortable to sleep in, though. I mean, even though you get booze and cigarettes, I mean, I guess when you're drunk, it's easier to fall asleep
yeah,
anyway, but
exactly. He just goes out, buys himself a bottle, and comes back. And because everything's owned by the government, everything's public property, so he's not breaking any laws.
so does he not care about missing his family?
He says that if they change their mind, he's willing to go back, and I think he has visited them a couple times, but they still are adamant about, hey, he's got to cut back, and he's still adamant that he doesn't want to stop. So, I mean, it's not like he's cut ties with them or they've cut ties with him.
And it's completely legal for him to be living in the airport.
I don't really know if it's. I mean, there are a lot of stories that I read where people who like lived in the airport for 3 6 months, like homeless people and other stuff, have been arrested. A lot of it is also like, do you cause any problems there? Because a lot of airports are public, and I've seen that in a couple of these stories that because they're staying somewhere that's public or publicly owned, they're on public property, and a lot of these guys don't cause any issues. A lot of the ones who've been like living in the airport, they shower every day. You know, they might take like a bathroom bath, a whore bath, but you know, they still like they, but like in you know they're spending money. You know, so they're not like nuisance. And yeah, he's drinking, but he's not. None of them are these last four guys. None of them are doing drugs or like doing any like committing any crimes, other than loitering. But some of these guys, like one of the next guys we're gonna get to, I think the third guy, like he actually worked at the airport, and so he worked and lived at the airport.
Oh, easy
You know
commute.
what? Exactly. Yeah, his commute was real short. Here, we're just gonna transition to him because he also still lives at the airport, but not the original airport he lived at. His name is Bahram Tepeli. So basically, his story is similar. In 1991, he was having some problems at home, so he ran away from all his family problems, and he got a job. He ran away to Istanbul, and he got a job, and then eventually his employer said, "Hey, if you go work at the airport, you probably could like live there too," because I guess he was tight on money, Mr. Tapelli. And he's like, "Oh, okay." So he got a job at the airport, and he started living there too. And after about 10 years, he started having health issues, so he had to stop working. But you know what he didn't stop doing?
Living at the
Living at the
airport?
airport. In fact,
This is the Istanbul airport. Where was this guy originally from? Do you know?
somewhere else in Turkey. I here. Let me give me more. But he moved to Istanbul to look for work and get away from his family, and then he lived. Yeah. So eventually he lived at the Ataturk airport. He worked and lived there, and then even then he lived there, and everyone knew him because he was also an employee there. And so even when he retired and he stopped working, they still all supported him. Like, and he would, he talked to everybody, get to know people. Some of the frequent travelers knew him, and people would like, oh, hey, look, it's Byram. Here's lunch on us, Byram. Oh, okay. He just did it to save money, and you know why he stopped living at the Ataturk airport in 2019?
Oh no, did he die or get arrested?
No, the Ataturk airport closed. So he moved to a new airport, Sabiha Gökçen Airport. I probably brutalized that name because I can't speak Turkish at all. But yeah, so when the new airport in Istanbul opened up, he, along with all the shops employees. He also moved along to the new airport, and he now lives in the new airport. And he misses the Ataturk airport. He lived there for many years. He lived there for 18 years. So he misses it. But he likes the new airport. He goes, it's very modern. Yeah. So you could, if you fly through Istanbul, I believe he stays at Terminal 1. You can also visit him. This next guy, so his name, he's a younger guy. His name is Denis Luis de Souza. He actually still lives in the Sao Paulo International Airport.
It is Brazil, right?
Interesting enough, yeah, in Brazil. Yeah, he's Brazilian. Interesting enough, he's never flown on a plane ever.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so even though he's lived in the airport for a good chunk of his life, he has never even flown on a plane.
Wow. That's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very ironic. So his story is a little sadder.
Okay.
He has mental health problems. I don't know if he's ever been diagnosed with anything, but he has the Brazilian authorities believe he has mental health problems, and because of his mental health problems, he would frequently argue with his family. He ran away as a young teenager, and in about 2000, and then for the last 22 years, it is he's been allowed to live at the airport. And from what I understand, it is not a crime to reside at Brazilian airports because they are publicly owned. And roughly about they don't know, and even then he doesn't remember exactly when he moved to the airport, but there's been reports that date all the way back to from about 2001 2000 that he's been living at the airport, and he will occasionally walk out and leave and come back, but like he just basically begs for money, begs for food, and just kind of keeps to himself. He's not as friendly as the other two guys. Just kind of keeps to himself.
I'm assuming that there's got to be a lot of health problems that come about with living at the airport. Because first of all, you're not getting any vitamin D, and you're eating shit food all the time, so you're probably constipated as hell.
Exactly. So that's what the Jara Kamalfar, the Iranian woman, that's actually what she had said. She goes, "My children haven't gotten any vitamin D in 16 months. That's why we need to leave there." I mean, among other things, and her son's teeth were falling out, and so that's happened. That's happened to a couple of these people. I know Byram Tapeli has had to leave the airport a couple times to visit the hospital, and then our last guy, that's actually what interrupted his streak, is that he
Okay.
had to be hospitalized. But I would like to get to the last guy, and because he's definitely a guy we're going to spend a lot of time on. His name is Mehran Karimi Nasseri, or as he now goes by, Sir Alfred. If you've heard of any of these people, it's probably him. He's definitely the most famous of the people who've ever lived at the airport. In fact, the terminal is actually based off, very loosely, I should say, off his life story.
Okay, so the Tom Hanks movie.
Yeah, the Tom
Terminal,
Hanks
yes.
movie. Yeah, apparently Steven Spielberg, or Steven Spielberg's people, let's be honest, paid him. I've seen a couple different numbers, but between about 250 to 300,000 American dollars for his life story, and he's written an autobiography too, also about living at the airport.
And he's still choosing to live at the airport after he makes this money.
Not long after the movie, he stopped living in the airport, but for other
Oh, good for
reasons.
him.
So it's called The Terminal Man. That's the name of it. So it was written by him and co-author Andrew Donkin. So if you're interested to learn more about him, check his book out. So his story is like I said, I'm gonna call him Alfred because that's actually how he prefers to be called now.
Okay.
He prefers to be called Sir Alfred Mehran. So Alfred was actually born in Iran, and he grew up to a relatively well-off family. His father was a doctor. His mom was kind of like a stay-at-home mom, and he was able to move to the United Kingdom for a while to study, and that's where he got his college degree. And then, not long after he graduated, he moved back to Iran, and basically, there's a couple different stories as to what caused him to leave Iran. The first was that his mom, and this is kind of Alfred's version of the story, is that his mom, basically, after his father passed away, cut him off completely and said, "You no longer have access to you're a bum. You no longer have access to the family fortune. But basically, she cut him off and said, you don't have access, you need to get a job, do everything on your own." And his mom and him had arguments in the past. The other side of the story is that while he was in England, he had protested against the Shah of Iran, and then basically and this was before obviously the fall of the Shah, and he was expelled from the country. Either way, he's kicked out of Iran and told not to come back. He believes that his mom actually, because his family was relatively well off, had convinced some people in the government to kick him out. Either
So
way,
he's banned from Iran, but
he
he's
is
still an Iranian citizen.
he basically in a way kind of loses his Iranian citizenship in a way. He's expelled from Iran, no longer allowed back. So he figures, screw it, I'm gonna go back to the United Kingdom, and he has not wanted to go back to Iran. He's not talked to his family, and especially with the current Islamic Republic of Iran, he doesn't want to go back, and he hasn't talked to his family since, especially not his mom. He hires a lawyer from Belgium that basically says, "Hey, help me get British citizenship." He's like, "Okay." He's going to fly to London through the Paris Charles de Gaulle airport. Basically, one of two stories happen. Again, and we're gonna get to why there's always one or two stories here in a little bit. He maintains that in route to the United Kingdom, and this was many years after he got kicked out of Iran, he was kind of stuck in a lot of legal nightmare hell for a while. As he was flying, that his briefcase was stolen, and his briefcase had all his paperwork in it. That's what he maintains. His lawyer said that once he landed in France, that he basically mailed to his lawyer all his paperwork and said, "I don't need any more. I'm on my way to England. I'm going to be a British citizen. We're good."
Those are two very different stories.
Exactly. He made a lot of dumb decisions in his life. A lot of really funny dumb decisions. Basically, he boards a flight from Paris, France to London, and when he gets off, he's like, "I'm home. I'm here in the United Kingdom." Like, "Okay, cool. Where's your paperwork?" And he's like, "What do you mean? I'm a British citizen. I'm here." And they're like, "Where's your paperwork? You say you're granted amnesty by the UN High Commission for Refugees, but we need to see your paperwork." He's like, "Well, I don't have it." After he gets off the ferry, he tries a plane to London, and they remove the plane. It's like, "You don't have the documents to fly," so they send him back to France. But remember, he has no documents. And of course, the Iranian government isn't going to back him up either. So now he's stuck in the French airport, because the moment he leaves, he gets detained by French authorities. He keeps trying to go back to London multiple times, but every time they either stop him from boarding the plane, or he can't get on the British soil. And eventually a French lawyer basically says, "Hey," and this is after 6 years, by the way, so to give you a timeline, in 1977 he's kicked out of Iran. By 1988, that's when this whole fiasco is happening, and where he starts residing in the Charles de Gaulle airport. So for 11 years he's already been stuck in this weird nebulous situation where he's been
Which is
trying.
a very bougie airport, by the way. That's not the airport that I would want to be stuck in, because it's full of very expensive, like designer clothes, and they don't really have a lot of restaurants. Like
Oh,
the
really?
restaurant choices aren't like American airports. No, they don't have like pubs and bars. It's like they have a couple fancy places, and that's pretty much it.
That's interesting
Yeah,
too,
and some like
because
quickie McDonald's.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's where the McDonald's comes in. I'll bring that
Okay.
up in a moment. It's funny we keep it. You know what? McDonald's sponsor us. He gets stuck in the airport in this nebulous situation. His lawyer helps him retrieve. He tries to help him retrieve some of his paperwork, but eventually he gets a French court to rule that because he did originally enter France legally, he had all the paperwork when he landed in France. He cannot be expelled from the airport. However, he also can't step foot in France because he doesn't have the paperwork. So legally, he is now allowed to live in the French airport in 1992 in Terminal 1, but he also can't step foot on French ground. So he's already been stuck there since 1988. Now legally, they can't do any, like, because he had gotten a lawyer. Basically, a lawyer worked for him for free. A lawyer heard his story and said, "Let me help you out. This sucks." And so now legally he can stay there, but he can't leave either. So he's really stuck in
What a
this weird
pickle.
situation. Yeah, and this is already after 4 years of living in the airport. So it's like, okay, cool. I guess I'm not a criminal anymore, but I also can't leave. And because he had mailed everything to Belgium to a lawyer in Belgium, his lawyer, his French lawyer, is trying to get him to either get the paperwork back, or the paperwork couldn't be found easily, or see if Belgium would issue some more paperwork so he could go to England. Because his goal still, as at that time, is to be England. That's why he started calling himself Sir Alfred, because that was his British name. See, if he had a British name, because he was a British citizen in his mind. This whole time, by the way, when people ask him, "Oh, are you Iranian?" he goes, "No, I'm British." As he has lived more and more in the airport, he wouldn't even respond to his full name, his full Iranian name, Mehran Karimi Nasseri.
Only Sir Alfred.
Sir Alfred Mehran. And this gets him in trouble because eventually France and Belgium both say, "Look, we kind of get it. He's stuck in this weird situation. If he agrees to sign some paperwork, we'll offer him residency." But Britain doesn't say that. They say he does not get to stay in Britain. Well, one, he's pissed off because he thinks he's British, even though he has no he does not have permission to enter the country legally, the country of Britain legally. And then two, whenever his lawyer talked to him and says sign this paperwork, he signs it Sir Alfred Mehran. The problem is Sir Alfred Mehran doesn't exist. Mehran Karimi Nasseri exists, and the paperwork is not valid. So every time and by the way, this lawyer is working completely for free. Like, his lawyer is very frustrated, and literally there's 3 years past.
I would be so frustrated if I was his lawyer. I'd be like, can you work a little bit
with
me and just like sign your old name and we'll call you Alfred afterwards?
The problem is his mental state kind of starts deteriorating. There was a really interesting interview from like the early 2000s that kind of describes the average day of Sir Alfred. He kind of wakes up, late morning, early afternoon, kind of just sits there for a while. When he has the energy, he'll shave or shower, but he doesn't have the energy to do that every day, maybe not even once a week. He will sit around. Sometimes he'll watch the news, sometimes he won't. He will look at some of his old newspapers that he has gathered around him, and a lot of the newspapers have articles about him because he's kind of a local celebrity in Paris, because everyone knows about him.
Well, it's kind of an interesting situation.
It's an interesting situation. He really his most frequent contact isn't even, let's say, passerbys or even airport employees. It will be journalists who want to interview him. And he mentions this, that like people at the airport will give him food, but he doesn't really talk to anybody anymore. I guess because he's been there so long and he's kind of stuck in this, like, he was stuck in this weird, purgatory essentially, where he has options, but because he is either so stubborn or his mental health, because remember, this is in 1995. He's already been stuck in the airport for 7 years. And
I would assume your mental health has to deteriorate in some capacity when you're in an airport for that long.
At any one point during parts of the story, he could have swallowed his pride, signed his Iranian birth name, and he could have been living in France. He created this own self-imposed solitary confinement. No one's ever been able to crack as to why he did this, why he was so stubborn. Did he, after a while, all these years, because remember, he's kicked out of Iran in 1977. It is now 1995 in our timeline, and he is still like without a home. Maybe it's not anything he did wrong. Maybe you put you or I in a similar situation. By then, I am also Sir Alfred, and I swear I'm a British citizen. It's a fascinating look at what happens when someone essentially lives without home, family, or country for decades, over 2 decades before we reach the end of our story. Because he even had a French movie made about him in 1993, and they got his rights, and he never saw the movie, or at least as far as I know, he never saw that movie or The Terminal. He said he would like to see The Terminal because he heard of Steven Spielberg, of course, but he was excited that Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks are making a movie that is based on his life story. The story moves forward to 2003 when DreamWorks buys the rights to his stories, but they don't use his story in the film. But he still would like to have seen it because it's a similar situation. Well, then we're going to jump forward to 2006. In Terminal 1, you can see pictures of this. You can just Google Mehran Karimi Nasseri, and he had this whole series of benches, and he had this little enclave where he had his possessions, he had newspaper clippings, he had some old discarded food containers. That all of this whole little living environment of his that was gathered around. Well, in 2006, the hospital employee, I'm sorry, the airport employees notice he starts looking ill and he starts getting a growth on his neck. And he's just looking more and more ill. And they finally convince him to leave the Charles de Gaulle airport for the first time in 18 years to receive medical services. And because he was going to the hospital, he was allowed to leave French ground. Basically, he ends up staying in the hospital for about 6 months. He had an infection. Yeah, he
Oh
had
my
an
gosh.
infection and needed antibiotics. And during these 6 months, his whole little settlement that he had gets taken down. They throw away the trash because he had a lot of old food containers, and they threw away
Mm-hmm.
newspapers. They didn't really throw away his belongings, but they threw away the stuff that couldn't be saved, and they kept the rest of it. And then eventually, the French Cross, the French Red Cross sponsors him, saying, "Look, he can stay in one of our shelters." Because
Oh.
they're like, hey, he can't go back to the airport, and eventually the French government agrees, says, look, he can stay at the shelter and we won't arrest him. And pretty much since 2008, he has lived in shelters in Paris. Technically, when you think about living at the airport, it technically checks off every box that humans need. It's shelter, you have access to clean water, you have access to food, you have access to social interactions, you're surrounded by people. I mean, you're not in the elements. Most airports are air conditioned. And maybe the smaller and like smaller countries, maybe aren't. But you're at least protected from like the harsh sun and the elements. You have a roof over your head, and yet every time you read about one of these people, well, exception of Mr. Wei Zhongguo, he seems to be living his high life, drinking and smoking. Most of these other people, they end
Yeah,
up,
he's thriving.
yeah, he's thriving, but everybody else talks about how miserable it was living in the airport, even though you meet all the basic things that humans need to live, that we need more than just that.
That was a really good topic because I have seen the terminal. Like, I wasn't really into it at first because I'm like, this is so unrealistic and stupid. Like, I first watching it and then I did some research while I was watching it. And I was like, oh shit, this is based on a true thing. It's really interesting to hear that this is actually something that people do.
People actually do. It's not a ton of people, and most are very, well, I say very brief. I know 30, 60 days doesn't sound brief, but their end goal isn't to be at the airport unless
Right, their whole life.
unless you're Wei Zhongguo. Then yeah, keep
And you
keep
just
on
want to drink and
keep
smoke it
keep
up.
on drinking and smoking, buddy.
Do your thing. I wonder what was his drink of choice. Where was he from again?
China, it's a liquor.
China.
Yeah,
Like,
he
oh, it is liquor?
yeah, it's liquor.
Nice.
Yeah, and I don't think I have anything else to say. I'm going to sign off, Ray.
Okay, perfect. I'll sign off as well. Everyone, I hope that you had a great day and you got smarter and a little bit stupider.